Hello from outside Boone, North Carolina. This is Eclectic Spacewalk Conversations. I'm your host, Nicholas McKay. Today we're joined by Jason Snyder. Jason is a self-labeled Meta-Modern localist who teaches at Appalachian State University. He is a budding homesteader and also interested in permaculture and bioregional regeneration. Welcome to Conversations, Jason.
Great to be here. See you in the flesh, not in a spacesuit.
Right. First time in real life, and
that's
not
right.
On the
that's right.
Twitters. We'll get into Twitter, obviously. Just so you know, we are in a budding homestead, so you might hear some sounds from outside, up top, everything. So just be forewarned, audience. But first, Jason, let's start off. Where did you grow up?
Born in Colorado, raised in Taos, New Mexico. Lived in Oregon for a few years, back and forth. Went to school in Albuquerque, so mainly New Mexico is where I call my home.
And then so from those kind of different places, Colorado, New Mexico, and Oregon, those are pretty different places. How was that?
Well, Taos was always kind of like ground zero in my memory, because we moved there when I was about a year and a half. And everywhere else seemed strange. It was like this bubble. It's kind of like actually near where I live now in Boone. It's kind of like this mountain town, kind of like this, it has its own vibe. And whenever I traveled outside, I always felt distant.
Okay.
It
like
always
not
felt
yourself.
strange. Yeah, it was just strange. Taos was ground zero, and it still kind of feels that way, but hopefully this will be my new ground zero.
Well, so if this is new ground zero, this is different weather than New Mexico, I'm assuming too.
Yeah.
Like big swings in that.
Yeah, a lot more moisture here.
Yeah.
I was only used to green in the riparian area, and I love it. I mean, I like all of this green and all of this growth. It's nice. I miss some of the sunsets and some of the smells of New Mexico and the culture and the food, but
you can always go back, I'm assuming.
I can always go back, yeah. I can always go back, yeah.
So going back to Taos and ground zero, what did you want to be when you grew up? Like, what was kind of early Jason? Like, what was kind of he into,
Oh gosh, how early? I don't think I had. I don't think I thought about it before like high school.
That's fair.
In high school I was, into like alternative kind of psychedelic literature and kind of expanding my mind in general, and so I think I wanted to become like a guru or save the world or something.
Yeah, sure, yeah.
At that time, or I thought, okay, well, like I need to figure out how to like save the world. It was very grandiose.
I'm just now getting off that path, Jason.
Okay,
just now.
Yeah, I mean, life definitely humbled me, later on, but it was, I had big plans.
Right.
Yeah.
So there's big plans. What were the things, I guess, early on then stroked your curiosity? That's kind of what I was going. Was it books? Was it movies? Was it a cool uncle? I always go kind of that example.
Yeah. So my mom moved to Oregon when I was 13. I went with her. I was completely depressed the first year in Oregon. It was just like, what is this place? It was always raining. It was, I wasn't used to that. So I went through this year of like really deep depression. And then the next year I started listening to like The Doors and other classic rock. And I started just reading kind of like, well, actually, The Doors was kind of like my pathway. I started reading about like shamanism and just, my mind just kind of started expanding from there, moving all kinds of different, I was really influenced by like 60s, 70s culture for a long time. And so you asked like, what is my influence?
Oh, just curiosity. Curiosity is really the biggest thing that I'm interested in. Like, what made you curious like early on? What were the things that got you like zesty about things?
I was really interested in this idea of becoming the Lizard King because of Jim Morrison.
just
that was like the earliest seed of like being, I don't know. And then, again, starting to experiment with like psychedelics and alternative states of consciousness, getting into like meditation, and I finally ended up going to an alternative high school where the head of the school, his two favorite authors were Bucky Fuller, who I know you're into, and Ken Wilber. Like those were his two biggest influences, and so you can imagine what that high school was like.
And those are two kind of disparate, but they're similar paths for sure, in a different way.
Different way, but kind of similar vibe of like, deep history, big think.
Yep.
trajectory of humankind. Sure. So later in high school, that kind of stuff became very influential.
Yeah. Buckminster Fuller is one of our biggest influences. Stuff. It's crazy.
I think I've heard that before.
So then let's take us through kind of your academic background. So you go through to Colorado, New Mexico, Oregon, and then you went to the University of New Mexico, I believe. Okay, and then take us like from there on to here now.
Yeah, so I got to college and I had been inundated with these ideas from this high school, and I spent like 2 or 3 years just kind of bouncing around, like taking different courses. I think, in retrospect, I was like a generalist and I was trying to find some kind of specialty, and I ended up with a degree in economics just because I thought, okay, well, they deal with like a lot of different like broad scale issues. It seemed like a kind of a generalist type of path. But then I kind of became a little bit disenchanted, I think, with economics. And so I got into geography, got my master's in geography. And then, bounced around again, worked for a, defense contractor for a while.
Hey, wow. Did not know that. Okay, Jason.
Yeah. Then we went back to Oregon. My wife went to get her master's and then Michigan, that's where I got my PhD.
Yep.
And then we came here.
So talk us about your PhD and how that was kind of different than, again, alternative high school, college, economics, you go to do geography, and then now it's like, this is a pinnacle kind of thing of research. Like what was it? And then kind of bring us through that.
So I kind of had this love-hate relationship with the field of economics. I remember talking with a good friend who was doing economics before, and we were talking about like all of the problems with like the paradigm, with the assumptions that go into it, and I was just like, well, screw it, like I'm just gonna bite the bullet, because it still seemed like, okay, I want to learn some skills, I want to learn how to like mess with data, learn some mathematics, things like that. So I went in that direction, looking for like, there was like a good international kind of development type program there, and food systems is kind of the direction I went into. So I ended up spending doing my research in Tanzania, looking at like food systems, like post-farm food systems. And that was all fine. It took me 7 years to do that.
I was about to say, like PhDs are, it's very variable on how long this takes.
Yeah, but then, especially near the end and into my postdoc, I started getting active on Twitter and, kind of, I think, reigniting a lot of the ideas that I had when I was younger. A lot of the same threads, like integral, meta-modern type stuff. And, I think I just slowly became disenchanted again with economics.
A second disenchantment.
yeah, and just kind of the paradigm that they operate from, and the kind of, I'd been basically trained as a technocrat, and it's kind of like a progressive neoliberal technocrat is basically I think it, with good intentions, but in the last few years I just basically decided, I don't think I'm going to really pursue this track unless I need to make money. But we ended up here. My wife, got her PhD at the same time. Yep. She got a position here, and it was an opportunity for me to both be, next adjacent to an apartment that I feel like more aligns with my values. So it's focused on like sustainability, and it's much more critical of kind of mainstream development, and so that kind of fit in, so that clicked in, and then getting more interested in kind of taking more seriously kind of our climate ecological situation, and what does that mean for like rethinking everything. Right. It's not just I think before it was more compartmentalized for a while, and so it was like, oh, that's that thing over there. And people like Joe Brewer was really influential, and just like, okay, actually, what would it mean to like center some of these things and pair that with deep history and the evolution of consciousness. And so I was like, okay, well, I'm in a position now where I can just kind of like teach, and kind of have very kind of interesting, broad-ranging conversations with students. Landed here in a position where I can like start to learn how to grow food, practice agroecology or permaculture. And so it just this is kind of what clicked into place.
That's great. It seems like there was a long time coming, and then all of a sudden now you feel like you're kind of at home or feeling
there.
Good.
Getting there. I see the trajectory, right? Because we're still new here. COVID has been difficult in terms of meeting people developing kind of the localist type of community that I talk about a lot on Twitter. But this seems like a good place to like, okay, now we're going to settle down and we're going to like build from the ground up. This seemed like, okay, now we're both in a life situation where we can kind of do that.
Amazing. Yeah. So before we get like continue on that vein, let's just keep on your doctorate just for a quick thing. Is like too long didn't read. What was the kind of the dissertation with Tanzania, and then also what maybe I guess not to keep in the past, but like how has that changed maybe? Because I'm assuming things have changed since your PhD. Like. I'm not familiar exactly with the food systems and stuff like that. So just broad stuff.
So it was my advisor and my committee, like they're really interested in like structural change in sub-Saharan Africa, and I think so a lot of my dissertation was like things like structural elements of the food system. So I looked at like
the infrastructure of it, or
kind of supply chains.
I see.
Looking at kind of like what is the structure of supply chain, who sells to who, and or like access to technology, and how to like small scale businesses get access to like technology, or like how do small players. I mean, I was really focused on like kind of small firms. How do they kind of compete in the market, in a kind of a market that's quickly consolidating and supermarkets are kind of taking over. And part of my tension with the whole thing is that kind of I think the ideology, it wasn't so explicit, but I think it was implicit. The ideology was like this kind of structural transformation is a good thing. It's part of development. And so like, foreign direct investment, kind of supermarket takeover, like this is kind of like this inevitable thing. And so how can we kind of like, clean up kind of like the messy aspects of that? And I think at a certain point, something in my mind just flipped where it's just like, actually, I taking a broader range of things into account, I just, this is not something that I really believe in or want to be promoting with my research. So, I mean, that's in a nutshell. I continued with the postdoc with some other folks in that department, focused on stuff in Zambia, but it was kind of, it was at the farmer level, but it was also kind of a similar thing of like, how, it was part of a larger ideology of structural transformation of like, we think and we kind of applaud that farmers are going to be, leaving the land, they're going to be seeking non-farm opportunities or going to the cities.
Oh, of course, okay.
And this was just kind of like this inevitable thing that I think was part of that worldview. And it was just kind of like, well, how do we, how do we promote that? Or how do we mitigate the downsides of it? At a certain point, I just started thinking, well, a lot of stuff that's going on in an apartment, like they're promoting, for example, farmers adopting fertilizers and like chemical fertilizers, and I'm just like, for example, and it's just like, well, are petro fertilizers really the way forward? Is this something that we should be like promoting all around the world? It provides you a short hit of productivity, but I think in the longer term, we're setting people up for failure, frankly. So I just a lot of started questioning that paradigm.
So continuing questioning that paradigm after your PhD and stuff. Now that you have this little bit more of a nuanced view of economics specifically, let's look at economics in just general. Like, what is it more? What do you think? I mean, again, like this is very anecdotal in your view, but like what needs to be done about economics? I mean, is it more participation? Is it more knowledge? Is it more diversity? Or like what exactly is the field in need of? Or I'm coming up from the outside, I can see some of the issues, and but then from I want to kind of get it from your perspective.
I think one, they just kind of need to scrap the neoclassical framework. A lot of most economists are aware that a lot of these assumptions that go into their models are flawed, right? But they're like, well, let's just use this as a baseline and then we'll add some complexity to it. But it's still very much dependent on like these mathematical models that are tractable, and in order to make it tractable, in order to do calculus basically on an equation that you're trying to represent reality, you need to simplify a lot because, or else it's just not tractable mathematically, or it's very difficult. You have to you find all kinds of ways to get around it, and then empirically as well. Like one of the major tools is like regression analysis, and
I was just about to say, like after the things, like what happens to accountability?
So you come up with these frameworks using, I think, flawed, methodological things. But then empirically, I also just stopped really believing in kind of this kind of linear analysis of like these 5 things or this 3 things cause this other thing. And,
I see.
So then I would say what needs to change. I think they need to adopt a more systems view in general, right? So they need to, and a less technocratic view. So I think, if you're a technocrat and your question is how do you help a place develop, and you're just trying to gather data to do that, and then you're running equations, and then you come up with policy recommendations. I just don't think that's a good approach.
Right.
I think that a lot of things about societies evolving are kind of endogenous. They're participatory. There's a lot of things about a culture and a system that you can't really that are not legible. So that's like the James C. Scott kind of point.
Is this also like what is her name? Nora Bateson and like warm data?
Yeah, that's part of it. That's part of it. Yeah. Donella Meadows.
Systems thinking. Here we go.
Right.
Yeah.
So she, like for example, she has like, downstream systems or leverage points, and one of the big points she makes is that you can't really, if you're an outsider and you want to help people, you have to have a lot of humility, right? And you have to spend a lot of time actually interacting with the people and the culture to kind of understand it from the inside out.
Right.
And I think a lot of economics tries to understand things from the outside in, from a kind of a technocratic world, technocratic methods and a paradigm, in my case, of like this idea of structural transformation of basically let's make all of these other countries like the West.
Yes.
And when you start getting into like sustainability literature, it's just like, oh man, like this system is not long for this world. Like something is like things are going to start collapsing, and we better start thinking about another way to think about how we live, how we conceptualize life, and so it's just like we can't like we're setting people up for the same failure that that we've created for ourselves.
Right.
I think that's fundamentally it.
I think you hit on a lot of great points in that, because I myself, even when I was writing essays and things, it's more of like a talking to, about things. And the switch came after I read Buckminster Fuller's Operating Manual for Spaceship Earth. And then it was more as an updated thing that I wrote an essay on. It wasn't going to be a book. You know what I mean? An updated operating manual for Spaceship Earth, even though that was great in the 60s, it's not going to be that here. What's going to be is like maybe a collection of thousands and thousands of interconnected of global and local communities, putting together everything, and then you can take but I think these neoclassical or any type of economics, people from the inside out, or outside in, is they see these frameworks and it's almost like plumbing. It's like from here to here to here to here, and it's like that's not how it is. It's more like mycelium or something. That it's like more infinite kind of opportunities.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of kind of the complexity stuff, like complexity science.
Yes.
It was kind of for me a nail in the coffin towards the training that I had received, and just
so we can thank Joe Norman for all of this.
Yeah. No, I mean Joe Norman was very influential for me in that sense.
Sure. For complexity as well, for me. Absolutely.
Absolutely. But even just understanding that things, systems are unpredictable, and you can't really optimize them. Again, from the outside, you have to just work with them, right? And they evolve, and so it was just kind of a flip in. I mean, I had already been kind of critical going into economics, but I was like, okay, this seems like the best option for me at this point. But at a certain point, it was just like, I'm not happy. I just wasn't really happy with my work, with my life.
Okay.
So something needs to change.
Right. Well, something did change, and you got, you're teaching here at Appalachian State. So this is from your teacher profile. So excuse me, but so let's talk about teaching as a discipline. Because now you're doing it. You had a thing on Twitter, sustainable economies and community development, that you have a class that's just starting. Yeah. But let's, I guess, set the tone for what exactly these classes that you're doing here in Appalachian State. So, quote, cultivating ecologically regenerative and resilient food systems in Southern Appalachia, sense of place and how it informs the coevolution of culture and ecology, and how traditional place-based wisdom can be integrated with environmentally appropriate technologies and novel forms of social organization to foster human well-being and inclusion. So let's just talk about teaching as a discipline. I mean, now you're doing it. I mean, I know you're not doing as much as a tenure track professor, your wife, but talk about that kind of trying these ideas and getting them into someone that's not like writing. It's actually you're talking with them.
Yeah.
So let's just riff on that a little bit.
Yeah,
do you like it? Like
I do like it. I do like it. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it's, I've always, I think, been very at home with having these kind of like broad generalist conversations about like the world,
Sure.
or the, society. And so, I get paid to like lead these discussions with students, having them read some interesting material and then just having these kind of broad range conversations and trying to integrate different perspectives. I mean, that's just, to me, that's kind of the dream, right?
Right. Yeah. These new minds are coming in, and I can kind of mold or shape them in a way that's positive.
And it's interesting, and it's also, kind of interfacing with what I do on Twitter. It's like, so there's, Twitter, I get a lot of ideas, and I put out ideas and get feedback. But it's interesting working with students because it's for one thing, I'm an older generation now. I'm an older millennial, and these are all Zoomers, right?
Right.
And so so just for me, kind of selfishly, like understanding this upcoming generation, like where they're coming from, like how do they respond to material, and and being surprised oftentimes, like, oh wow, like I can't assume what people think, or I'm surprised. It's like, wow, this student is really insightful in ways that like I don't really find anywhere else, or a student is just kind of like, oh, like something I've taken for granted is like, this is obvious, it's not obvious to them, and understanding why, and perhaps me understanding why it's not obvious to them, gives me some new insight as well, right? Like of like, okay, like. And so, one interesting thing I've noticed recently is that, and I get from their reflection essays, is that they've been inundated, like they're taking a class in sustainable development, so they've been inundated with like, this knowledge of like climate change and all of these precarious, indicators that are starting to reach us, and they've experienced that their whole lives, like they've heard about that their whole lives, and so. That's one kind of difference, I think, is that, there's, I don't know if there's more, I think there's more realism in some ways. Like
we were sheltered. Yeah, I didn't even know about any of this. Coming up when I was growing up, there was a 15-year gap of just bliss or whatever you want to call childhood.
Right, or it just wasn't as urgent.
Exactly. That's basically scientists were doing stuff, but I wasn't aware of any of that.
And so getting kind of from students themselves, like just the fact that for them this is I think much closer to many of them. I mean, not all of them. Like some of them don't care or whatever, but that's a really kind of interesting perspective that I don't think I would have gotten otherwise. Right.
So teaching. Well, speaking of, so I went on Rate My Professor.
Oh
boy. I found one. He is understanding, and he requires 1 paper, journals, a communication project, and 2 tests. He did a great job during the uncertain semester with COVID-19 and responded to emails promptly.
Oh, well, right. I need to look at Rate My Professor.
No, that was the only one. So there was you have 100%.
Oh wow, okay. Yeah.
But that was kind of more funny and whatever. But
that's funny.
So let's go on to a little bit more of. And we'll stay on academia for one more kind of question. But so Google Scholar says that papers you have been a part of have been cited, 600 times or something like that.
Yeah.
What does that mean? And then, can we talk about academic publishing in general? Because then I'm assuming this is part of all this that we're talking about in terms of development. Well, where do they go? They go to these papers and these publishings and stuff like that. So is the pipeline of scientific publishing or academic publishing flawed? What does that mean? And how? What is your kind of any thoughts on that?
I don't really have strong thoughts on it, to be honest. I mean, so for me, I kind of lost interest in doing that kind of research.
Right.
So what does that mean? I mean, so I was basically co-author on a lot of papers of my, major professor, and a couple of reports that I was lead author on, and one of them in particular got a lot of play, or has gotten a lot of citations that I still see today. But I think part of me I'm still going through this kind of transition process is just kind of losing for myself faith in kind of losing interest in this kind of academic publishing research. So I don't know if I have a sophisticated critique of it per se, but just for myself, like it's too remote. Like I mean, just the whole process itself. Maybe this is a critique. You submit something and then you might hear back like 3 or 6 months later. I mean, the whole process takes years.
Yep.
But even when I was doing, being part of these papers, like I don't know how confident I was in what we were saying, just because the data, like you can't really know how good the data is. Like you try your best, the methods, like there was just so many points. And at a certain point I thought like, okay, like what, like there's, you publish a paper, either there's a couple options. Either you're kind of reinforcing conventional wisdom, or if you're not, if you're kind of challenging conventional wisdom, there's a good chance that it's because your data is flawed or your methods are flawed, and so but then the small chance that you're both challenging conventional wisdom and it's like legit, then the chances of actually reaching policymakers' ears and actually, translating to something that, actually has a net good in the world.
Is it convincible?
Right. So convincing a policymaker to adopt it, okay, that's another small probability. But then even a smaller probability is then this piece of information is in the hands of a technocrat. Even if it's the right insight, the way that they, apply the policy could have unintended consequences. Yeah. If it's like this top-down thing. So it's just like the whole way I was just kind of like, I just don't like, I don't think I'm providing much good, in the world doing this. And so I just, at a certain point I was like, I just want to be more engaged, right? Like if I'm, so teaching is nice because you can actually like,
that's at one-to-one or one to small groups.
But then besides that, other things is just being more involved with like projects or, being directly involved, like here, hopefully getting directly involved with the food system and actually just being a part of it and not studying it from like this kind of almost like false objectivity, but like, actually experiencing its challenges and its change from the inside.
Wow.
And so just being kind of a part of some kind of development, I definitely yearned for that.
Yeah. No, it's more like action rather than words and stuff.
Yeah.
It's like you did enough words, and then now you're kind of like you want action.
Exactly. Just and so part of that is just this whole change of like wanting to become more embodied. My meditation practice started shifting towards a much more kind of embodied. Just the importance of embodiment and the relationship between the mind and emotions and physicality. And
some of our listeners may not really even know anything. Can you give us a real quick thing about embodiment, or even we had on Jeremy Johnson and talked about integral consciousness and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But what exactly in that does embodiment mean when you say that when you're like meditating and stuff?
Well, I can tell you what it means for me.
Sure. Yeah. Perfect.
So I mean, for a long time, I felt like I had this problem, which I thought of as a problem, where my mind would just kind of like spin out of control, and I had these kind of like emotional complexes that I would try to think my way out of, and I just couldn't. Okay. And at a certain point, when I started learning like just basic mindfulness meditation, that maybe you can't really think your way out of these kind of emotional issues, right? And so just making the switch from like I feel uncomfortable, let me try and rationalize my way out of it, let me try and just feel into my body, let me like actually like say body scan or
like feel it out, like what exactly are you doing,
like where is the actual the mental tension. I started learning to trace it to physical tension, and that was fascinating, right, to discover that really for the first time of like, oh wow, like the mind body system is much more integrated than I thought. Right.
My big thing was the gut biome and how that things that you eat, and everything like that.
Right. It's all connected.
All connected.
Exactly. And so, and at that time I was interested in like philosophical questions of like the mind-body problem and stuff like that. And it all just kind of like came together in terms of like, the necessity of not relying so much on, deductive reasoning, basically.
Sure.
And and kind of feeling your way into being, for lack
I
of,
like
for
that.
lack
No,
of a better phrase.
Honestly, because I've been there too, like two in your head, thinking so much, and it's like some of the times when you just calm down, and then it's like, oh, what exactly is that? Like that you almost are meta-ing it. You know, it's like you can get into these like what do they call it? Like what's it off the with waves, like rip currents. You just stay in a rip current. You can't move, and it's just hostile as hell. And then it's like, but you really just need to calm down and then kind of get out of your body. That's cool though, you know, like that you've kind of changed things a little bit.
Yeah, and there was kind of a natural connection there. On Twitter, sometimes I talk about like this idea of situated cognition, right? And that's, you know, in retrospect, I don't know if this is the exact linearity, but in retrospect, there's this interesting kind of convergence of like embodied cognition of like understanding things more intuitively, you know, through your body, but then situated cognition of like understanding your sense of place. And you know, and for myself, you know, I've always kind of, you know, been a placeless person. You know,
you're moving around,
moved around a lot, but even going to New Mexico, I was always an outsider, right? Like it's not like I had many different generations there, and so there's an interesting connection for me that, you know, it's still interesting to me of like this connection between, you know, embodiment, which is more of kind of an internal sense field, and situatedness, which is how does that internal sense field relate to, you know, your immediate environment. And so that's just, that for me, that's just been a really kind of fruitful intersection to explore.
That's good, because then that connects you also not just with other people, but then also your environment, your reality. Like you have to have constraints. So like there are constraints, and you got to deal with them. You know. So.
Yeah, and that also fits into my critique of, say, the economics of the outside in point of view. I was like, well, being, you know, learning a place from the inside out, you know, evolving with it, co-evolving with it, you know, that's all part of this kind of like embodied situatedness kind of thing, and it also, you know, aligns with kind of my critique of economics as well.
That's good.
So yeah,
cool. Well, so let's switch gears a little bit to kind of let's go to the digital sphere. So you had a podcast with Jared James called Both And. It's no longer going right now. Can you talk about how it started, how it went, and ultimately, you know, why y'all stopped? Because that's originally how I came upon you. And then what did you learn about yourself about this? Because I'm assuming that you went through a couple things with the podcast, but then afterwards, I'm assuming you had some key learnings for yourself.
Well, I met Jared online on Twitter.
Sure.
We were both interested in like meditation stuff, pragmatic Dharma kind of scene on Twitter. And we just started talking over video and decided to start a podcast. I mean, it was, so the Both And was very much kind of like big picture, like we both kind of came in of like, you know, we can both see multiple different perspectives. You know, we're both kind of influenced by kind of this meta-modern sensibility of just like, you know, understanding kind of how deep history and evolution of consciousness has led to this kind of fracturing of worldviews. And so like, can we use this podcast to kind of like build bridges? You know, this idea of mimetic mediation, which was, you know, Peter Limburg came up with, and that was, you know, Peter was like our second guest or something. And so like, and that was very intentional, because that's kind of how we wanted to, you know, that idea of mimetic mediation was really kind of the you know, kind of the incentive for the podcast. And so, yeah, I mean, it was fascinating. You know, we tried to have a pretty diverse array of guests. You know, everyone from, you know, we had Michael Brooks on once.
Yeah.
We had,
R.I.P.
You know, but then we had somebody. You know, we had like somebody like Zero H.P. Lovecraft, who is a whole ball of wax. You know.
Oh yeah.
And you know, so just trying to bring in, you know, a lot of the people kind of had a similar sensibility, like kind of, again, I would say a meta-modern sensibility, but there was a lot of kind of, you know, we try to get a lot of kind of divergent perspectives. And
there were intersections for sure.
Yeah, there were intersections. And, you know, then we kind of got sucked into this kind of like sense-making space that people started calling it. And so it was kind of like this little scene for a while. And we'd go on our friends' podcasts, you know, Peter Limburg and Daniel Thorson, you know, like there was this whole kind of little complex of people we had similar guests, and we shared guests and stuff.
Yeah, it was all the family, kind of your own podcast collective almost.
Yeah, it was like a little podcast collective, and it was really fun. And so but I think what I learned, you know, I think through the whole thing, I started consolidating what I think about, because I started off like, okay, we just want to like entertain many different perspectives, but then I think my perspective after going through that process started to consolidate more. You know, I started getting more and more interested in like, okay, like localism or multi-scale localism, bioregionalism, and the regeneration stuff, and that's just started calling me more and more. And so I stopped being so neutral, I guess, like a neutral mimetic mediator, and I started becoming, I guess I started having a more solidified point of view. And at a certain point, we just stopped because Jared was the engineer, and he got too busy.
Yeah, he's doing some stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, and he wanted to do other things. So that ended like a year ago.
Yeah, but I mean, overall, like you said, like good experiences. You met a lot of people.
Exactly, met a lot of people, made a lot of connections, and I think some of the conversations really kind of helped me evolve to where I'm at today.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Well, going off of not just podcasts and stuff, but we met on Twitter, and seems like so many things nowadays are happening there in every single way. Yeah. News, connection, in-group fighting, out-group hatred, typical metamodernism, So how has Twitter helped, I don't want to say hinder you by any chance, but what are some of the pitfalls too of this social media kind of stuff? And then but there are obviously some good things, Twitter's a dumpster fire, but there are some good things coming out of that at some level, so.
Yeah, so you're asking about the good things? Or
the both, because I want to see I think honestly one of the things about the stuff that I don't like about Twitter is so much of the in-group, out-group stuff, because you just get into these little zones, and then that's it. And then that's one of the things that we were trying to do, like you were, is trying to kind of connect these little things that have similar thoughts. Yeah. You're on the same page, but then you guys aren't talking. And then that's, I think, the beauty of social media, or people, then you cannot go there. I can't go to Uruguay, but I can, or I can't go to Bali or whatever, but I can kind of be there in some sense. But then at the same time, like you were saying, it's like, but I'm not really there, So it's so I'm not. So I don't know if there's some tension with some of the social media or digital sphere into real life. So I just didn't know if you want to riff on that a little bit, because Twitter is interesting.
Right. Yeah. There's a lot of directions I could go here. So it is, you do lack that embodiment perspective, which is problematic, right? Yep. So you're having kind of these parasocial relationships that. You're having relationships with an avatar who puts out little text messages, right? And so there's something a little strange about that. I go back and forth on how optimistic or how how much I like being involved with Twitter. I mean, I love all the connections I've made. A lot of people I met in person now, which is great, and just the inflow of ideas back and forth. I wouldn't have got that off of that platform. At the same time, I think I've become a little bit less optimistic about the project of mimetic mediation, just because I feel like I just kind of got burned out trying in my own mind to try and connect perspectives and bring people together, and I started just realizing that people really want to fight. And people have good reason to. People just have very, in some ways, irresolvable differences.
But then now I've seen you kind of, even though, and this is just me personally seeing your Twitter kind of stuff. Yeah. And I mean, this has been 2 years or something we've been following each other. And then for the last maybe 6 months or so, it's been way more a little bit more irony, a little bit more touching buttons just to touch buttons. But then it could be a question that you just leave out. And then, 10 minutes later you say, actually, I don't like that, or whatever. Yeah. And it's you've been playing with it a little bit.
Yeah.
I have seen.
No, I mean, at a certain point, you have no choice but to employ all kinds of mixes of sincerity, irony, and really kind of, you're kind of testing, you put something out there that you don't know how it's going to land for different groups of people, and it's it's really fascinating to get people's reactions, and, but at the same time, at a certain point you start realizing that, okay, I'm, quote, unquote influencer at a small scale, and people are reaching out to me and asking for advice, and I'm just okay, I start feeling kind of the weight of the responsibility of feeling the need to be more responsible on the platform, right?
Right, and you're I just want to shitpost sometimes.
And so when I do shitpost, I try and make it very kind of, I guess, obvious, so people don't take it seriously.
Right.
Sometimes people do.
Oh, of course, right? It's Twitter. Yeah.
So there's a lot of contextual loss involved in the process. What else is there to say about Twitter?
I mean, there doesn't have to be anything more.
There's also the issue of that I've been a little concerned about for a long time, is just getting sucked into a reality tunnel. that, I feel like it's very easy to kind of like take a pill, but it happens slowly over time, and you're not even aware that, you're becoming extremely ideological in certain ways. And so like, being aware of how the platform and the algorithms are entraining you, are leading you down one direction or another, are pairing you with certain people or another. Sometimes I get worried. It's like, is the stuff I'm putting out there, could it be misused for, ideologies that I think are pretty horrific or whatever, right?
You don't subscribe to it at all, but then at the same time gets pushed that way.
Yeah, and lately, to be honest, like the last 2 weeks, I've just been like not really on Twitter, just because it's just after a certain point, especially when there's like these kind of hot button issues, like right now with COVID and vaccination, I just get on and I just see like, these diametrically opposed positions and, a lot of like scapegoating and us versus them kind of.
A lot of bad faith. There's no good faith.
Yeah, and it just starts getting depressing after a while, and so I just need to take a break.
Well, then let's take a break from Twitter. Then let's move on to bigger and better things. So I wrote an essay called Technopoly, and that was like basically about Neil Postman's idea that when a new technology gets introduced, it is an ecological change, like environmental scientists talk about. It's not good or bad or neutral. It just it changes literally everything. So in that regard, technology, we've grown up with technology now, and it's all ever pacing. But now there's been some resurgence of people not exactly pushing back, but then other alternatives and stuff, and working with that. So I want to kind of talk about technological optimism, technological pessimism, and that kind of distinction. Yeah. And then maybe even what you were talking about a second ago, or alluded to, technological realism. It's like, what exactly is that and stuff? And then some of the thinkers maybe that are along that, Wendell we've talked a lot about on Twitter, maybe some other influences of who else, is kind of used to revitalize the culture in that way, technologically,
Yeah. I do see this as a kind of fundamental fault line in kind of ideologies that I see online of like, kind of a techno-optimistic point of view. I think it's just kind of implicit. Like, for example, when I see what are called the post rats online, like they don't mention it, but it just seems implicitly that they're kind of techno-optimists. Like they're just like, they kind of assume that the future is through technology, the singularity is going to happen, and we're going to deal with that, and we're going to get nuclear energy going, and our energy problems will be solved, and our climate problems will be solved. Like that just seems to kind of be like a default assumption, even if it's not so explicitly stated. As opposed to, for example, I would say the bioregionalists, who are much more skeptical that we can keep relying on technological breakthroughs to solve the problems that prior technological breakthroughs have created for ourselves.
Absolutely.
Right? And it's like we've been playing this high wire game for a long time, and from the bioregionalist point of view, like time is starting to run out. Like we're running out of planet to keep playing this game, right? And so and that's kind of the direction I think I've started to lean towards, of being more skeptical of this kind of rapid, because like you said, with technological change, you like kind of changes everything, cultural change, and like what Wendell gives voice to is just the immense amount of loss, cultural loss that we've had through this kind of restructuring of the economy in the last 50 to 70 years, right? And not just cultural loss, but ecological devastation, right? And that also came from kind of this kind of like modernist, kind of progressive, technocratic kind of optimism or faith, right? And so,
faith is a good word there. Yeah, faith is a real good word.
And a lot of it, I think, and I think I can say this because I think I used to be more in this camp as well. Of like, I just kind of assumed by default that we would invent our way out of a lot of the like technology would be the solutions. And when I started reading like Joe Brewer and just getting this kind of very starkly different perspective of like, no, like this is all collapsing and we're preparing for what's coming after that. Like that was kind of like a splash of cold water, right?
Like it's already a non-starter that this is happening. We're already planning after it. And people keep discussing that, and it's like, no, we need to move on from that.
Right, and so at the end of the day, now I try, especially talking with students, and like I try and keep myself as open-minded as possible, even though my bias is clearly towards clearly towards more kind of landed-based kind of sensibility and living. I try not to close myself off from like technological event that we might need, right?
Sure.
So for example, I think nuclear energy here is a good example, or like fusion technology.
Yep.
I think, I try to, we don't know if, for example, fusion energy is going to come online in time to really make a difference before we have some kind of collapse.
And it's
situation.
been on the eve for
decades. For decades, and that's the thing. But when I catch myself saying, or thinking like, I don't want it to come online because that will just kind of accelerate kind of the consumeristic culture that will cause other kind of ecological. I try and stop myself and be like, okay, perhaps this would be a good thing because it would, perhaps it would save a lot of lives. But then, so I try and integrate kind of a techno-optimist perspective in my point of view. But
so that you don't
whenever I can, even though I tend to be skeptical.
So you're making sure that at least for you. I like that because obviously you're not letting anything in your things are going to fall through the cracks, but you're trying as best to not let that happen. Which is like that being open is huge, but then having a set kind of way of thinking is also huge as well.
Yeah.
It's like I don't know which one is better or not.
Right. So for example, next week in my class, we're going over the future of energy. Right.
Okay.
So I'm going to start with I've thought a lot about how I want to present this. Right. Taking my own bias or sensibility in mind, and it's like, okay, I'm going to start with just presenting like, here are all the kind of alternative energy technologies out there. Here are the pros and cons. Solar panels, wind turbines, nuclear energy, geothermal, like all of this stuff, and present that and say, hey, we should probably get off of fossil fuels, and so these are some alternatives. But then, I'm going to, present material from, for example, like the Post Carbon Institute, the author Richard Heinberg, who basically says like, we need to get off fossil fuels, we need to go to renewable energy technologies, but it's not going to power our society in the same way. We're probably not going to be able to maintain this high energy consumeristic society. And so what does that mean? How do we pre-adapt to probably a lower energy future according to Richard Heinberg, but also but the energy will also be very different, right? Like it'll be more flows instead of stocks, so to speak. Like the structure of the economy that we're used to was built around fossil fuels. And so, for example, like how do you make cement or steel with electricity? It's extremely difficult.
I see.
Right?
Like generators or this or that or whatever.
And so and so like sure, we can try and electrify everything, but it's going to be. I think people don't like that, and we might invent our way out of these tough challenges, but I think people don't they just kind of like have this vague notion of like, okay, we'll just switch to nuclear, solar or something and it'll be fine. It's much more difficult than people realize. Like once you actually get into, and it'll imply a lot of change about how we structure society, right? And so that's where the realism comes in of like, even if we do, and then I think folks like Ashley she's more skeptical than me about like, renewable energy technologies. Like she's more of a Rathognon, proponent of like all of this kind of high tech stuff is just fragile, and I sympathize with that point of view as well. But I don't think I'm as further along, I'm not as Rathognon pilled as some people. But I do think that a lot of the way, a lot of new technology is incredibly wasteful. And so a lot of these kind of traditional patterns and traditional, say, building techniques and, traditional agricultural techniques, we need to recover, right? We need to actually learn from the past again and bring it forward into the future.
In his specifically, I've loved the architectural stuff. Because I had not even known anything about that. And it's like, what is brutalism? What is this and stuff? And then all of a sudden, you look around, and we live in Los Angeles, obviously. The architecture that Rathognon hates the most is all around us.
Right. You probably wouldn't be that interested in geodesic domes either.
No.
Speaking of Bucky Fuller,
Speaking of, let's keep on with this kind of technological realism, if you will, and because and maybe there's some through lines, so I'm just gonna kind of riff for a little bit. Because some of the tension going against that post-carbon is like, say, for instance, or at least for me, thinking about it is like countries like India or people that are coming up. It's like it's very highfalutin for us to be like, hey, we did all this stuff and we got to this like level of knowledge, whatever, and then you people, you can't do this, you have to do this other stuff. And it's like, but then that's maybe what's going to be needed at the same time. And so I'm trying to think about how that's going to work, but then maybe is bioregionalism really the ideal size of like politics and collective decision making? Because I think we've gone on Twitter about this, like the nation state is like ridiculous, and the nation state was just invented a couple of decades ago and kind of things. And so what can we do in terms of collective decision making? Is bioregionalism that? Because it's not, you're connected to the whole planet, if you will, in some ways, but then at the same time, you don't have to take on all the things from all the different places.
There's, I mean, a lot of things to pick up there. I mean, one with like developing countries coming up that are growing really quickly, like India. I mean, so, you know, the planet itself, like if the whole world tried to adopt the same energy consumption patterns as the West, like we would just all die.
Literally,
like it's just that's
the book Overshoot, right? Overshoot.
Overshoot. You know, and so if they did, you know, in terms of development, that there is the potential for leapfrog technologies, right? So you know, a common example is like in Africa, they skipped landlines, right? They went straight to zero phones to cell phones, right? And a lot of actually innovation in cell phone technology is happening in like Kenya in terms of like payments and information for farmers and stuff like that.
That's right.
And so you can imagine, you know, up and coming countries like India, you know, it's kind of skipping. I mean, they're already using fossil fuels, but by and large, skipping the fossil fuel stage, you know, and moving straight to kind of like whatever nuclear, solar energy, whatever, right? And so. So there's that. That's just kind of maybe an aside. What was the other part of your question?
Bioregionalism.
Yeah, bioregionalism.
Politics, collective decision making.
I think a more general framework for me is the kind of cosmopolitan localism.
Right.
And so for me, it's like, okay, what are kind of like the most natural scales that are interesting to think about, right? And so like I think the family scale and the village scale are two, and then you think of, but then, you know, and so it's both cultural and ecological, and then you think, okay, the watershed scale, because you know, having different ownership structures or different kind of governance structures in the same watershed is very problematic in terms of ecological coherence, right? And so that's, and then up, what's higher scale than that? It's bioregional, and what's higher scale than that? I think it's global. So I think those are kind of like, to me, those are kind of like the most important scales. Now, the cosmopolitan part comes in is I do think that, you know, some problems need to be handled on a planetary scale, right? And, you know, but it has to be done, we have to think about it differently than kind of globalism that we understand it today, which is, you know, I would say is more of an extractive, you know, system, or kind of, you know, winner take all, you know, kind of system, or a race to the bottom dynamic.
Or, I mean, very for me, it was top down to bottom up. You know what I mean? Like if we're telling people what to do, then like, I don't know if that's going to work. But then if we allow people the resources and the knowledge and whatever, then they can figure it out themselves, and all of a sudden we're on the same page.
Yeah. So, you know, on my optimistic days, you know, I think that, you know, with new technology, especially communications and, you know, new currency type digital currency, like we can kind of piece together, you know, some kind of intelligent, you know, global system that, you know, on the one hand is kind of minimum viable scale, right? So it's kind of from the bottom up, right? Like you know, if you can handle things locally, you handle things locally. But, you know, for like ecological flows that are at a bioregional scale, you handle that scale, and planetary the same thing. But that requires, you know, kind of these nested levels of kind of coordination, which,
I like that.
Nested, you know, and a lot of people are working on that, right? Like Gregory Landra, Planetary Gen, you know, he's like
Region Network,
exactly, like that kind of stuff. I think is potentially really cool. You
Disclaimers: we have Cosmos, so we also have Cosmos. We're in it. We're full in it.
Yeah, exactly. And even someone like Joe Brewer, like he talks about, you know, creating kind of like, you know, he has a platform, right, where he's trying to create this kind of like planetary, you know, solidarity framework basically for bioregional regeneration. So he's, you know, even kind of like the ecological realist people who are seeing collapse, like that, like, you know, a lot of them are pursuing this track as well. Of course, in my less optimistic days, I just think that collapse is going to happen, and we're heading back to it's going to be really dark times, right?
Like different pre-industrial kind of stuff.
In my free time, I read about a year ago, I read like Dark Age America by John Michael Greer, right? And it's a very dark picture of where we're headed, right? And so I read dystopian, like near future dystopian fiction as a hobby, right?
So Parable of the Sower is probably the biggest.
I haven't read that one.
Jason Snyder. This is your these two books. Parable of the Sower and Parable of the Talents.
Yeah.
It's a very, because usually people ask me, like, okay, if there's one book to do about what is happening, whatever, people usually go 1984. That's an easy one. Authoritarianism is on the rise, blah, 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 blah.
Right.
Or you go Brave New World.
Yeah.
Aldous Huxley, Soma, everyone's just like jazzing themselves to that. Or you go this like realist thing of like, okay, ecological degradation has happened, and then what does that mean? Like to a normal person that's growing up in a place. So just to give you a little, so they're in a tight-knit community, they know how to shoot, like some of these kind of things, and then all of a sudden, but they're constantly effective for raiders, because people who aren't in that community want the stuff that's in that community. And then that's what it seems like, this Mad Max kind of thing. So that's on the recommendations you got to read next.
Okay, I'll take a look at that. But a lot of related literature, I just read for fun, basically. That's amazing. And everything in between. So I kind of where I feel like I'm positioning myself is like, well, in either case, what is a useful activity for me to do now? Well, one is to learn how to grow food in a ecologically sustainable manner. That just seems like a pretty important thing to focus on no matter what. No matter which future we're headed towards.
Whatever techno future is there, like that seems like a through line that's going to be there regardless.
Yeah, I mean, in either case, I don't see industrial agriculture being long for this world. And so like what's, whether it's a highly connected kind of like, new kind of global planetary organism that arises, or whether it's, a much more kind of dark ages, Mad Max, or, new neo-feudalist, whatever, post collapse of Roman Empire, which, some people argue was actually pretty great for a lot of people. So,
for maybe the Germans or the barbarians
for some folks, where it's like, okay, the big brother is finally going off your back, you're kind of left alone, you still have to worry about raiders or whatever, but like it's like a different set of challenges.
It's different.
And so in either case, it's I think, if I can think of like, okay, what's a useful activity, no matter, given this uncertainty, it's learning how to connect to the land.
That's interesting. Cause let me challenge you on one thing. Have you seen the movie Arrival? Okay, so that's kind of for me the
I don't remember what that.
It was like the best techno-optimist kind of thing, because basically that Ted Chiang, the author, he was trying to do what sci-fi writers have not been doing in the last 30 years, and it's all just dystopic stuff. So he wanted not utopic, but more of a better kind of thing. And so I'm just trying to think of like, is that also in your library, like of those kind of things, or is it really just like more the realist kind of things to kind of get me in the mindset of what I need to do?
Lately, it's been more of the realist stuff. To be honest, I mean, I think I think it's kind of a reaction to, 5 or 10 years ago, I was probably much more interested.
I see. Okay.
In this kind of,
the pendulum is swinging.
And so I don't know if it'll swing back somewhere, but I just try to, I guess I just try to not fool myself. And like kind of, and I find that being a little skeptical, even if I err on the side of skepticism, is, for me, it just seems a little more solid grounding to be, right? Like I don't want to fool myself into thinking that, basic things that most of us take for granted, like basic subsistence, is always going to be, the supply chains are always going to be delivering food to the supermarkets, stuff that we need, clothing. Like I just don't, I don't want to take that stuff for granted. You've
described yourself as a baby homesteader, so this is all new, kind of in the last 2 years. So talk to us about like how what is homesteading life, and then what are some good, bad, sad, all the juicy stuff,
Well, I mean, so I'm coming from a place where basically I didn't, I was always kind of a thoughts or computer guy, and so I really didn't know how to do anything, and I still don't know how to do most things, right? And so taking my basic kind of provisioning for granted that it'll always be there, and so I think part of trying to become more grounded is just trying to be closer to some of my kind of basic sustenance, right?
Sure.
And food is the obvious. So learning how to grow food. That said, the baby homesteader part is like, I'm not anywhere near some kind of self-sufficiency ideal, and I don't know if self-sufficiency is the ideal in the first place, right? It's interdependence, it's community, but being able to be directly involved with kind of basic practices of providing for yourself, I think to me it's not only kind of like a good idea in terms of like becoming more resilient, for example, but it's also, I would say it's a spiritual process of like, for me, of going from more of a disembodied type person to actually learning how to use my hands, starting to learn how to like build things, grow food. And so for me, it's just like, it's a process, right? And I'm in my second year, it'll probably be 10 or 20 years before I feel like, okay, like I actually know what I'm doing.
Right. You actually feel that imposter syndrome is gone.
Yeah, exactly. And so I say homesteading, that's something I do on Twitter, but for me, it's not like, I hope people don't think that I'm trying to say that like, I could build my own cabin right now and I grow all of my own food, like, or make all my own clothes, et cetera. Like I don't, right? But engaging in that process of learning how to do these kinds of things is important to me now.
And then you said as well the self-sufficiency, because I think that's an interesting point, is maybe a lot of people will think that okay, every single homestead you just need to be self-sufficient, but then you're kind of saying, well, in a neighborhood or a community kind of aspect, if you have chickens and another person has pigs and another person has whatever, then you can kind of have this local economy kind of moving around, right?
Yeah.
That's more the
ideal.
ideal.
And ultimately, that's kind of my, what I want to help in this bioregion, right? Or, this region or bioregion is, contributing to what I would call a more sustainable, regenerative economy, right? And, for me, the more kind of informal it is, the better.
Right.
Really, you're kind of outside of kind of the legible system, so to speak, right. And and so that's, and how can I contribute? Well, one way I contribute is to actually produce things that I can, use for myself, for my family, but also offer to other people.
Right. And then, so what are some of the, let's go into maybe the, not I guess pros and cons and good, bad, ugly, but then what's kind of the biggest thing you've learned about that, and then maybe one thing that you had thought that and then got changed, or something like that.
I think one thing I've been thinking a lot about recently is how to maintain fertility on your land when you're growing like annual crops, which might seem very specific, but it's just been on my mind a lot lately. So for example, I don't want to use fertilizers because I just see, I see it problematic for many different reasons, but not using fertilizers means that I need to, when I grow food, I need to replenish, the fertility. Well, how do you do that? Well, composting and stuff, but then that brings up a whole new set of issues of like, can I produce enough compost? Where am I going to get the biomass from? Am I going to borrow fertility from other parts of the land?
I see.
And then I start thinking about, well, what if I added animals to the system, or went more in kind of like a perennial direction? What's the optimal balance there? So I think just moving from the realm of kind of like idealism of like, oh, I read a permaculture book, I'm ready to go, or I read an organic gardening book, I'm ready to go, to actually, seeing those constraints for myself and seeing the real challenges with this alternative approach, and it's not it's not a silver bullet solution. Like, it's also difficult, right? And it has its own. And so just realizing that for myself and having to think, try and develop, a solution or a set of responses that is very appropriate for where I live, right? And it'll probably be different from somebody else who is in a different place and also different sensibility and everything else. So I think that's been, again, going back to the embodiment, just the embodiment or the situatedness of actually, seeing, okay, I tried to grow tomatoes this year and they didn't do well. Well, probably didn't add enough fertility. I wasn't taking care of the soil enough. I wasn't encouraging microbiology enough. Okay, so like that's a very real thing, and I'm really, really glad that I don't, that I'm not going to starve this year if I can't feed myself, right?
You don't have any tomatoes. Oh no.
Exactly. And so I also see this as kind of like a responsibility of like, the more that I can learn when the stakes aren't very high, if and when the stakes do become higher, I can, it's both good for me, but it's also I can be of help, of service to others.
Sure.
Like, okay, like all of a sudden more people realize, hey, like many more of us need to grow food. Well, I can help people avoid the easiest mistakes. Right.
So if people are coming to you for maybe those easy mistakes, then who are you going to for the harder mistakes and things? Because it's like, are you going to like library resources? Is it people around because I know COVID, like you said.
Yeah.
But what is kind of that process of learning? I mean, I know you're getting your hands dirty. Yeah. But then how are you kind of like getting better at it?
Yeah. Well, it's all of the above. I mean, I read a lot of books on kind of gardening, agriculture, permaculture, agroecology. Twitter is a great resource. Going back to Twitter, there's a lot of people with a lot of knowledge and experience, and so you have a question, or even if you post something and like people give you advice, sometimes unbidden advice, but it's still helpful. Talking with friends, I have a couple of colleagues who.
Your entire department.
There's at least like two or three people in my department who have been growing, have been along this track much longer than me, right? And so, throwing ideas off of them, getting their advice, is really helpful as well.
That's
so
awesome.
all of the above. Yeah.
All of the above. Okay.
Yeah.
So for homesteading, what would you be? I guess someone who's maybe a technocrat, someone who's maybe more of the, doomers and stuff like that. What is because I've seen a lot of people start getting land, and everywhere around the world. So is that just what it is? Like get something and then get your hands dirty kind of thing? Or is it like kind of see what your situation is and where you are in life and then kind of plan accordingly? Or obviously you got to do that anyway, but.
Yeah, I mean, at least from what I see on Twitter, it seems like a lot of people are getting land. Perhaps I have a biased sample or whatever.
Sure, maybe, yeah.
So there's going to be a lot of issues that we're going to have to work out, and I think, a pretty valid leftist critique of kind of the homesteading movement is that you're kind of just reinventing private property, right, and kind of this accumulation. And we really need to be thinking more about like the commons or about more mutualistic. So like cooperatives, community land trusts. And, I think that's correct. But at the same time, for a lot of people, I think, if I were to say like, should you wait until we have the ideal political structures to start learning how to grow food? No. Like if you have access to some land, you should just start growing some food. Like you need to build skill. It's not just kind of an ideal political structure. You need to have real skills. Right. So I kind of understand. So I think it's good that people are getting land and starting to learn to grow food and stuff. But I don't think that's like the final solution, because that creates a lot of new problems, right? It creates
that's a panacea for other people.
It creates gentrification. Like if you talk to somebody like Neil Boyle-Dow, like he sees it all as gentrification and libs coming in and driving the locals out, and that's a real dynamic. That's it's problematic. And so I don't know.
I honestly, it's all good.
Yeah.
So from the homesteading, we'll move on, because that was homesteading. Now we're here. It's interesting to see. Like I grew up in Tennessee, and my grandparents, like they had a house out and they had chickens, pigs, everything. So nice. I grew up with that. But then now the other part of the conversation that we kind of really came here for was not just homesteading, but then also doomer optimism. So doomer optimism. Basically, I'll let you kind of talk about it, but Jason and then also our former Conversations guest, Ashley Colby, kind of coined the term and kind of got it going. So maybe I guess you could just set the stage of like how that kind of came to be, and then we'll kind of get into it.
Yeah, I mean, it was just, there was some kind of mimetic tractor online of like, folks like Ashley and I, coming across each other, and other people who are generally kind of more you could say the realist side, ecological, and also like peak oil type people, and people who see kind of collapse in general, starting to find each other, right? And Ashley I think coined the term doomer optimism, but it was a sensibility that I think many of us had kind of been batting around in our minds of like, okay, we're kind of pessimists in terms of where the current system is going. You know,
it's all doom and gloom, basically.
Yeah, but that doesn't get you up in the morning,
Nope.
right? And you know, being nihilistic or depressed is just, it's not healthy. It's not healthy psychologically, and it doesn't actually solve any issues. You know, it doesn't give you a path forward either. And so, what does it mean to, you know, to really grapple with the deep challenges that I think a lot of people take for granted or don't recognize, but still, you know, do something productive and try and carve out an alternative, right? Try and carve out something that, even if some kind of collapse does happen, or it is happening, and it would be multiple decades, you know, is there a transition strategy, right? Is there something that can we build the infrastructure for a new set of patterns that can kind of catch people, right? So I think that's where the optimism comes in, is like, you know, we only have, this is our one life to live. Let's try and be as productive and as useful as possible, even though we see that things are really hard.
Yeah, because the counterfactual, it seems like if you were just doomers, you know, it's like it just creates more apathy, I guess. You know what I mean? There's no way around it. And then or unless you have some big person come in or big tech, but then even then, like, it's still this doomer kind of thing. But so I really like the optimist kind of aspect of that. Some of the vocabulary stuff that is around, Ashley and I have gone through it. So the Anthropocene, you know, we're living in the Anthropocene, you know, these the ecological breakdowns, mass extinctions. So that's kind of the realism of the doomer. But then all of a sudden, you know, we talked about Operating Manual for Spaceship Earth and then Cosmopolitan Localism. Well, those seem like a decent, at least, through point into the optimism, at least more so than focusing only on the doom. So is there other vocabulary, other things that kind of are in your mind when you think doom or optimism? Like, what are some words? Because for me, when I think about it, solar punk is like such a big thing for me, because it's like, okay, that's like a very high-tech layer on a very embodied and bottom-up culture. So is that like what we strive for? Is there other things? Like,
I mean, I think solar punk, I like the aesthetic. I think that's kind of like best case scenario.
Right.
So in my more optimistic days, I'm thinking, okay, maybe something like a solar punk future is in the cards, you know. But, you know, in my more pessimistic days, I'm thinking more like, you know, kind of village economies of the past, right? More rural, you know, kind of a de-urbanized, you know, everybody's, you know, more people are involved with growing food, more people are involved with their kind of, you know, provisioning their basic needs. And, you know, and perhaps it'll be something in between, right? Again, you know, I think I'm a little bit more hesitant than some other doomer optimists to throw technology options out completely, but you know, this idea of a high-tech layer on top, we haven't really learned, you know, we don't really have, you know, modern technologies that don't have some serious downsides, right? In terms of, you know, extraction, you know, rare earth minerals, we're going to get those, all of the energy that goes into
exploitation,
extracting the basic ore, smelting, you know, creating these giant machines, transportation. So like, you know, having this global system that can still trade, you know, again, if you want solar panels, you know, I'd like to get solar panels at some point, but you know, I also recognize that, you know, all the parts for that come from all over the world. It requires global supply chains, right? And global supply chains are fragile. And so you know, so it's kind of like, I try and keep both things in my mind, right? Of like, that would be nice if we could figure out how to minimize the negative externalities or externalizing the costs, but you know, at the same time, I don't want to put all my cards in that basket, right? Like what would I do if all of a sudden we ran out of electricity, we ran out of energy, right? And so going back to like reading, you know, near-term dystopian fiction, like I recently read a series by Kunstler, John Howard Kunstler, A World Made by Hand, which is exactly this kind of scenario where like all of a sudden, basically electricity just runs out, and like nobody has, you know, is connected to a grid anymore, basically. And so like, what would that look like? And
that might look like if we have a solar flare. You know what I mean? Like that's a real thing that could happen. You know, all of a sudden, all information technology goes off overnight.
Yeah. And so, what would that look like? And I'm definitely not prepared for that scenario. Not even close.
Either. We're not.
You know, exactly. Nobody,
we're banking on
really nobody is.
Even
homesteading. You know, most people on homesteading Twitter, like nobody's really ready for that, right? Like we all have dependencies.
Yes.
Like
that's a good
there's
point.
maybe like 2 homesteaders in the world that have like 0 dependencies, right? And we haven't heard about them.
Is that just being honest about the dependencies then? Is that really what it is about? Like, because then it's like you get all these, when you're not honest about it, then you have these preconceived notions or these ideologies, and then it's like, well, none of this is really real. Like,
I do think that there is that could be a tendency in homesteading Twitter to kind of like, and Ashley's talked about this, of like just presenting kind of like the cottage core, like the nice aesthetics and stuff like that, but like kind of pushing under the rug that like, hey, we're still connected to an energy grid, all of our tools, everything is sourced, from parts all over the world.
Yep.
Where do you get your shovel, right? Are you getting it from your local neighborhood?
Did you cast this alone? Yeah,
exactly. Or did you get it from, does my neighbor build, wheelbarrows and shovels? And no, they don't, right? Like I go to Lowe's or, the local version of Lowe's, right? But they, that sources from all over the world. So it's just, I think a little bit more realism in terms of like taking a little bit of the fantasy element out of the homesteading aesthetic. As Ashley says, like show the kind of the grit, grimy, and the fact that we've just, okay, we're growing like maybe 10% more of our own food, but that's not going to save you if everything falls apart overnight. Right. And so for me, it's like if we're lucky and if we are headed towards kind of a collapse of our current systems, it would happen, over decades where we have time to adapt, right? And we have time to make the transition to something different with the minimal damage possible. That would be, to me, that would be the ideal collapse scenario.
I see.
Is, multi-decade. But the thing I worry about is the harder life gets for people, the more, like, for example, scapegoats they're going to, irrelevant scapegoats of like, it's really, this group of people that's causing my suffering. And so, I can also see the rise of not all of us kind of banding together and figuring out, a new system state, versus just all-out war.
Right.
That's a real worry.
That's almost like that's almost what we're banking that almost will happen, but then we're hoping that it won't. Like, because that's really true. That's a good point.
And so the more that each of us can, try to empathize with different groups of people and try to see many different perspectives and get to know our neighbors. The more all of us do that, the better off we'll be in that kind of like the more trust that can be built now. With different groups, the better. But sometimes I get online on Twitter and I get very pessimistic. Right?
Sure,
just like I see a lot of this us versus them dynamics. A lot of which seems to be misdirected. Right. To the deeper structural problems.
Right. And then now, but you guys are exploring a little bit. You, Ashley, and also and Trace Crow, right? That's the other guy. So you guys have just started almost like. This collective kind of podcast thing because it has now gotten to the point where people were like hounding you guys on Twitter and everything like, what are you guys doing with this? Because this is such a great idea. But now you guys are here. I mean, I was part of one of those, cheerleaders.
You were one of our biggest cheerleaders.
But now it's happening. So can you talk us a little bit about that update and then what's kind of the future? Because again, you had just talked about kind of the pitfalls of Twitter and podcasting and that stuff. But then how can you guys moving forward, like, you guys are honest about that, I'm assuming. So what are you guys doing to maybe mitigate some of those pitfalls?
Yeah, well, I think the Doomer Optimist podcast is part of that. I mean, a lot of it I think is we're just trying to have conversations with people who have some kind of knowledge to share, who can help people, or who are doing something that's really positive in the world, right? Like maybe they, maybe they have a really successful farm, permaculture farm, or maybe, I don't know, they're developing some kind of platform or digital currency that can bring people together some way, and we're just trying to have conversation with those with people who we see are not naive techno-optimists, but are trying to do something positive in the world, right? And just direct people, give them a platform basically. So for example, like Ashley just talked with this guy Josh, who's just relatively unknown guy, but he's been homesteading for like 10 years and he's developed, he's really good at it, right? Like he has a lot of knowledge to share that, so like giving him a voice,
is a big deal.
It's a big deal, right? And so like, and then for the listener, seeing all of these examples of alternative ways of living, perhaps they can get involved with various projects, right? So just trying to be a connecting force among all of these different, often isolated, endeavors or very small scale endeavors, and make it more broad scale. So increase the connectivity across, all of these different folks that are trying to do something.
And one of my biggest pushbacks, I guess or maybe one of my biggest things I would have said a critique when you guys started was like, hey, don't just do kind of the podcast, like kind of branch out into other things. And one of the biggest things that I saw was you guys' website, the resource website. I think Chris Dancy did something with that.
Yeah.
Beautiful, incredible, because then that is like, it's a repository of information that anyone and everyone can go in and what do you want? You want something about permaculture first? You want homesteading? Or great. So if you guys become, that's like, again, pie in the sky stuff. But I was really floored when you guys kind of saw that. So are there any other kind of things like that in the mix, or what else are you guys going to try to do?
I've kind of like been less active so far in the start stage. Ashley, fair. I think. Ashley has 100 ideas a minute about these kinds of things. Right. That's the idea. I mean, so the thing is, we can't. I don't want to over-determine what it's going to become. Right. So I want it to evolve and get different people involved. And I'm so far I'm happy. Like we've had Anarcho-Contrarian. That account. He's booked 2 guests. Him and Joe Norman are going to be interviewing Ben Falk, who's a really well-known permaculture guy. Okay. Right. And so I think at this stage we're just trying to get as many people involved as possible and make it really like a collective, not just with rotating hosts and different formats. It could have regular interview style, but it could also be roundtable, fireside chat.
I like that.
It could even be debates. Slowly people stepping up like Chris Dancy to actually start aggregating, some of the resources that people are throwing around. Yeah. And so that's, so I'm hoping, I don't want to, I feel like whatever I say of what we want to do, it won't happen. Right. But something that, but unexpected things will happen. And so
emergence will happen.
It's an evolving organism. And, I don't feel like I'm central to it. I feel like I'm a bit player, and I can try and help as much as I can, but it's going to be as successful as a whole group of people want it to be successful, and want to use it as a platform to highlight, to bring something new to awareness, right?
We're in that train, and we'll obviously, I'm putting it out there that we'll be part of this collective as well. And then I just started thinking, obviously, with us going to Germany, that might be an interesting kind of thing. Is what are they doing over there? Right. And then you guys can take the differences of that, and then
exactly,
learn,
exactly. Yeah, you can be our German connection.
Yeah, exactly.
Exactly.
Yeah, we'll figure it out with the joining in. But let's go to the last question. Okay, so this has been great. We've talked a lot about everything, and so we talked a lot about localism. But maybe let's kind of reinvent or go back to the Cosmopolitan. And so I asked all my guests, the last question, if they were experiencing the overview effect, which is basically you're an astronaut looking down at Earth, part of that inspiration mission with SpaceX or at the ISS or even on the moon. You're looking and seeing the Earth for what it really is. It's the reality, because when you're here, you don't see how it is. And then even satellites don't do it. So if you were up there, do you have anything to say? Do you have any advice, practical advice for just people? Is there a lowest common denominator thing that you would just tell everyone, or anything, or it could just be read a book? Do you have any kind of things to say?
I think 2 things. One is it's probably a good idea to start thinking about your basic needs and not by default assuming that those will always be met through the larger supply chain systems, right? So start thinking about, where does your food come from? Where does your water come from? Where does your energy come from? Everything else, clothing, fibers, just, if not to produce for yourself, but just to kind of become aware of, what are the, what would it look like to become more resilient, or at least become aware of where things come from, right? Just start bringing that more to awareness. And I think just kind of, that will necessarily, incline you towards, for example, again, the lowest hanging fruit is starting to grow things, right? Learning how to grow food. But then, so the other side of that, the Cosmopolitan part, I think that it's easy, and it might be increasingly easy to have scapegoats for what's going on in the world, what's going wrong with your life or what's going on in the world. And, I would just try to remind people that, we're all part of the same fabric of reality. We all have different life experiences. We come from different places, and we have different ideas about what's right and wrong. But don't be so quick to cast blame on some other group for what's causing your problems, even if it's like the big bad whatever out there, right? And try to recognize that we're all kind of in the same boat together, as a humankind, but also as a biosphere, right? Yes. We're all part of the universe looking at itself.
Right. Yes.
For the overview effect.
Exactly. And that's literally what it is. So we're all part of that, and then also you should basically be becoming aware of what exactly is your reality, what exactly is your environment, and then all the things that you need to live in that environment.
Exactly. So try not don't try not to think of us versus them dynamics. Even I do that myself.
Yep.
But try and recognize that at the end of the day we're all in this together. And when you realize that, then we're gonna, as a collective, we're gonna have to figure out how to survive, perhaps under much more difficult circumstances. And so, what would that look like?
Beautiful. Yeah. So more good faith all around. Yeah. Cool. Well, I think that wraps up things. So thanks for coming on Conversations, Jason.
Yeah, it's an honor. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. And until next time, guys, ad Astra.